Here's the block for September. Acorns, I know I love acorns, so you've seen them before. This one I decided to color in a little bit. So I wanted to show you how I did some of the shading. So for the leaves, I started with the goldenrod, and I just did a really light layer over that area. And I don't know if you noticed, but I did leave the freezer paper ironed onto the back, and that helps stabilize the fabric so it doesn't wiggle around while you're coloring. This is the pattern, which is how I traced it. So I printed the pattern on the paper side of the freezer paper, ironed it to the back of my fabric, used a light box to trace it, and now I'm just doing the coloring. So the second step on these leaves, I pulled in this moss green. So for these, I'm just kind of adding a little bit of green around the edges, just to give it a little bit more depth, because in the fall, those fall leaves are all sorts of different colors. So that's how simple these leaves are. You could even add a little red if you want, or some other colors. And then for the acorn, I started off, I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget, with the burnt sienna, and I just colored the whole thing in with burnt sienna. Then I went back with the sienna brown and I think this is just brown, to really shade it. So I'll show you on this side. So I'm going to go back in like this. And down below here, and even a little bit under the cap, because the cap's going to throw a shadow a little bit. And now I'm going to go back with the even darker brown to really try to make that edge even darker, to give it some more curve or roundness. I don't know if you could hear that, but I'm having a little plumbing issue, so bear with me. So now we've got a real rounded shape because we have the shadows that are on either side. So I'm hoping once I paint it with the fixative that this will kind of all blend together. That's my goal anyway. So the other thing I wanted to do on these caps, I didn't want to fill the whole thing in, but I'm just kind of going at the top of those little diamonds. Maybe a little on the edge. Just so that it has a little bit of dimension, but it doesn't need to be completely colored in. And then I just filled that in with the brown, this little stem. So the most important part when you're doing this is you want to finish it with a colorless extender. This is a fixative, and what it will do is once you paint it on, then when you're stitching, your hands aren't going to rub those colors off. And once you're completely done stitching, you're going to press your piece from the back side, and the heat is going to set those colors. So you can wash it, and they are permanent. So this jacquard textile medium you can get on Amazon. And a little jar like this lasts a long time. Actually, I already have one that's open. And you don't want to apply it too thick because you are going to be stitching through it. I use just an inexpensive craft brush that's kind of blunt on the end, not a point. And you just go over where you've done your coloring. And it does kind of smear the colors together, which is kind of what I was hoping for. So that's a plus. So it does make the colors stand out a little bit more, as you can see the difference between that leaf and that leaf. Okay, so let me see if these were real different colors, or if some of it came off on my brush. I'd probably rinse my brush before I start on to another color, but I'm just gonna skip over here. And then I wanna see what this looks like if I just add a little bit of color or fixative to these spaces on here. It just gives it a little bit of texture, I think. So I'm going to finish this cap up, and then what I wanted to mention too is when you're doing a piece that has shading, like this nut part of the acorn, you want to start with the lighter parts and then work your way out to the darker parts so that you don't pull the dark into the lighter parts. Okay, so that looks pretty well covered. So what I mean by that is you're going to start on, just the opposite of that. You're going to start in the center because we want to keep that nice and light. And like I said, you don't want to apply it too thick because you are going to be stitching through it, but it isn't too hard to stitch through actually. And then once you get that center part, then you can move out towards the darker area and do some blending. I really use the paintbrush to maneuver the colors around as much as I want. Kind of smooch it around. That was a lot there. And if you do go outside of your color line, you can see right there where I did a little bit, and it actually brought the color out onto this other part of the fabric. So you want to be careful just to keep your brush just where you have colored. You don't want to spread this over the rest of your fabric because it will take those colors. Okay, I'm going to finish applying this medium and then we can start stitching. So here's this piece finished, and you can see I filled in the stem with just rows of stem stitches right next to each other, so they're touching each other. And the smoke is back stitched. This is just a stem stitch with a little French knot in between. The doorknob is a pistol stitch, which is a type of French knot that I will show you. So after I did this colorway, I decided to do it on the mode of crackle with just one single color of thread. This is bronze, which I love bronze because it goes with about anything. And I think bronze is actually what I used for the leaves too. So I love bronze. So I've done most of the stitching on here. On this sample, I did not fill this in with lines of stem stitching because it would be just too heavy, I think. So I just did a couple of stitches to make it look like bark. Doesn't that look exactly like bark? That's what I thought. Okay, so you know the stem stitch, but I'll go over it here just to refresh your memory. So you're going to start at any point. You don't want to start in the middle of a line. Just start at a point somewhere. And if it has a curve, then you're going to carry your thread on the outside of the curve. This is barely curved, but I'm still going to carry my thread on the outside. So I have my thread at the very beginning. I'm going to put my needle down about 1/8 of an inch and then come back up pretty close to where the thread came out, but not all the way there. A little more than half. Now I'm going to take 1/8, 16th through 1/8, and bring it up in the same hole that the previous stitch just ended. And you always want to carry your thread consistently. So if you're carrying your thread on one side, do that the whole way down. Don't switch it. And first I went ahead and stitched one direction. Now I'm stitching the other direction. I'm just going to stitch right over the previous stitches. So just right over these stitches. So that is as simple as it goes pretty much for a stem stitch. The other stitch that's in the cap is a French knot, and I like them big and chunky, so I did 3 wraps around. So I'm going to bring my needle up in the center of these little diamonds, wrap my thread around 3 times. I kind of hold it with my finger there, and then put the needle down really close to where I brought it up. Slide those wraps down to the fabric, and you want them snug but not too tight. And then I hold them with my thumb and finger hold this thread and then pull the needle through, and you have this nice dot. And I love dots, and that's a fast way of making them. I like how chunky they are. Colonial knots I love too. They're not quite as chunky, and I like, in some instances, I really want them to be chunky. So that's how you do a French knot. A pistol stitch is a type of French knot. So you can see on the pattern, there's a dot and a little line coming below it. So we're going to start at the base of the line. We're going to end where we want the dot. So same as these French knots, I'm going to wrap it 3 times. And then I'm going to put my needle down on that dot. So I'm not really close to where I started, like on French knots, but I'm going to take it up above there. And then just like a French knot, you pull those down. Not too tight because you don't want to pucker the fabric. And then pull it through. And what you end up with is a French knot. That's a very short little tail. You could make it a little bit longer than that if you want. So it looks like a door handle. So it's a French knot with a tail, basically. It's called a pistol stitch. One thing I wanted to point out too is instead of stitching these windows and turning a corner and then turning a corner, I tend to stitch this way, then hop up here, stitch this way, then hop down here, stitch this way, if that makes sense to you. But you can do it any way you want. So, I mean, that's just a short distance to carry a thread, but that way I don't have to take the time to really turn a really neat corner. Okay, and then the smoke is a back stitch. So for a back stitch, you're going to start at one end, and you take about 1/8 of an inch, and then you come up 1/8 of an inch. So it starts off like a running stitch. Now we're going to go back at the end of that first stitch, past where the thread comes out about 1/8 of an inch. And then you repeat that. So you go back in the same hole where that previous stitch ended, past your thread. And this forms a really nice thin line, and it's really good for turning tight corners, which the smoke is. And I wanted the smoke to look a little more light and airy, and I think that does the trick on that. The last stitch I'll show you on here is actually the simplest stitch, and that's the running stitch. And that's what any dashed lines are. So if you've ever quilted, it's basically the same thing. Or if you've just, sewn 2 pieces of fabric together, you're just going to go up, down, up, and down. So it's like a basting stitch, if you've ever done that. But it's a nice way to add a little bit of texture. Not too much to go. I'll finish this up. Here is the finished stitchery on the Moda Crackle with the bronze. And here is the finished one that's been colored and stitched on the Moda linen. And I like them both. They both have their own different feel, and they'd both be good on a little zippered pouch or in a fall quilt or whatever you can think of. So I hope you like this design. This was a fun one to stitch up. And we'll move on to the next month. See you then. Bye.